We're about active, low carbon and biophilic cities. I do have some good news for health, most of what I'm saying. I'm on the IPCC trying to do something about climate change. It's often pretty depressing and despairing, in fact, but there is good news because we are now decoupling wealth from greenhouse emissions. We are still growing in wealth levels across the world, but greenhouse has peaked in the last 3 years, going down. And you can look at various countries and see some doing it more than others. But what does that mean? Because we've often heard that the only way we're going to solve this problem is to get poorer. We don't have to get poorer. And what that essentially means is that budgets can continue to grow. And there's a lot of people in this room on public budgets. Public budgets don't have to get restricted. If we're getting poorer, everything gets cut, right? We're the kind of groups that get cut. We shouldn't expect that into the future. We can survive this era of climate change and thrive on it. We know now how to grow our economies and save the world in terms of climate. And it is a big part of the budget, health. The other good news is that cities are disrupting. They are becoming more active, low carbon and biophilic, and I want to quickly show how do we enable it. The reality is Europe is way ahead in this. You see the decoupling there in Denmark, but most of the European nations are like this. It took a little while to get going back in the 90s, but most of this century the growth in wealth has continued. In fact, now the climate change options of getting rid of coal and oil are the basis of the next economy, and these are the places that are doing it best. The US is doing it, even in the last 7 or 8 years, and Donald Trump can't even stop that. In Australia, we've grown sharply. The coal and oil are going down. India is not, like many emerging countries, but they are. The gap is widening, and in China they are actually getting to the point where coal and oil are going down. So how's this happening? We call it disruptive innovation. The word's used a lot these days, but it started from Clayton Christensen at Harvard, who tried to understand how technology can sometimes surprise us, and certainly surprises the people doing projections into the future, and I'll show you a few. But he started off by looking at floppy disks. Remember them? 3.5-inch disks were more expensive per unit of memory than 5.5, but they fitted into a purse or a bag and you could carry them around, and the 5.5s were too big and bulky. And all of the manufacturing and retailers of 5.5-inch disks went bankrupt. And the whole system changed because suddenly we could make personal computers and carry the whole thing around. The system changes. So disruptive innovation is now happening in energy and transport. First of all, coal. Solar and wind. This is the new building of energy across the world. Solar and wind way ahead of fossil fuels. This is where the investment is happening. This is not just government doing it. This is the financing of new energy. And what are the projection people in the World Energy Outlook from the International Energy say? Every time solar went up, they'd say, oh, it's going to flatten out, it's going to flatten out, it's going to flatten out. They're totally wrong. They just couldn't see it. They just projected from their perspectives into a flat line, and it's exponential. So the price of solar is going down everywhere very rapidly. You can see it's gone, 10 times cheaper, and therefore is now growing very rapidly. In Perth, like most Australian cities, solar has taken off, but we had a boom. People put their money into putting solar on their roofs. 30% of the city of housing now has PVs on the roof. That is now the biggest power station in Western Australia, on rooftops. It's happened so quickly. It's disruptive. And people chose it. There was no government program. They just did it. 70% predicted by 2025. Now here's an example of a study we're doing. This is Josh Byrne from Gardening Australia, who works for us, and he has a fully monitored house. You can look out on his website. He's had 40 million hits on this website. Extraordinary information. And it's a zero carbon house, very beautiful, certainly not affecting his wealth levels, but the holy grail is the battery system, which are clearly changing the whole thing, because he's now essentially got an ability to take the sun and use it in the evenings. So battery growth is doing the same thing. It is disrupting. The price is dramatically reducing, and the growth is now settling in. So you will see in the next decade massive increase in solar and batteries together. We have a precinct that's been developed, White Gum Valley, WGV it's now called. Pretty ordinary little suburb in Fremantle, but it's suddenly become a world first, because it's the first place where solar and batteries together are being managed by the community, not just individual houses. Medium density development, there's social housing there, and the whole thing is being managed with peer-to-peer trading, P2P. Everyone's talking about that. This is the only place in the world where it's actually happening, and so we've created a citizen utility. It's community-based. And it is managed through the blockchain, new software, very smart, but it's a way of enabling the community to look after their own power needs. So it's a system change. The power's becoming much more local, community-based, with grids less driven by the long-distance power plant. That is unpredicted by most of the energy planners, and we've written about that. The oil, which is much more about active cities, is also being disrupted by the end of automobile dependence. Now, if you've heard me speak over the last 30 or 40 years, I've been pretty boring, because I've started on this back in the 80s, talking about automobile dependence and how it was the big problem. And right through this era, now you can say how cities are moving beyond car-based planning. I don't know any city in the world that is trying to be automobile dependent. They're all trying to stop it. And that's a major breakthrough in my lifetime. And you can see it in the data. So back in the early part of the century, we started to see a plateauing and then a decline in car use per capita. Then it flipped right over in American cities and in Australian cities, pretty much the same year, 2004. And every Australian city, small and large. And Sydney's down the bottom and Canberra's on the top there in terms of per capita car use. The modelers, what did they say? Oh, it'll go back up again because wealth is increasing. Wealth means we're going to drive more. No, it doesn't. Because our cities are changing, wealth is going up, but car use is going down per capita. I know you get stuck in traffic still because a lot of the car use is occurring at peak times and you get that congestion. So the global growth is now in rail, 82 Chinese cities, 51 Indian cities, Middle Eastern cities, all building metros. Dramatic increase in rail. It's called the second rail revolution. In England, there are now far more usage of rail than in the previous times when it was the leader of the world. Now, if you go to a city like Tokyo, just keep in mind the Four Corners show, we're all doomed, we're not going to make it, the cities are destroying. This is 38 million people living in one city. It works. It actually isn't a problem for them to be so big because they've put it into different ways of movement. So if you look here, where does the metro go? It follows those lines, see that? And there's reasonably lower densities between that. But where people really want to live and work is on the metro lines. And it's probably got the most walkable city I've ever been to. It is just such an easy city to walk around. What about the emerging cities? Shanghai and Beijing, aren't they going to destroy the world? They're all going to become like American cities. Well, they started out growing that way, and the first thing they did was start to put in a lot more freeways. But they filled very quickly. What do you do when you get a city that's suddenly very dense but full of cars? You build the world's biggest metro in 10 years. Shanghai built 420 kilometres of urban rail. 8 million people a day using that. So Shanghai's bus services went down, but the dramatic increase was in the metro, that blue line, and Beijing as well. But you can see the private vehicles that went up so quickly plateaued off the red line, and it's now going down. You don't hear much about this, do you? But Shanghai and Beijing have changed dramatically, and there's no more investment in freeways in Shanghai and Beijing. Some of the other places it is, but it's flattened out, is no longer increasing. This is the most important figure of the lot. The growth in wealth has continued in Beijing, but car use is going down. Now that sends a signal around the world to developing countries, to cities everywhere. You don't have to have car use to be wealthy. Cars are actually a problem now. So just get on with creating a better future and see that they don't do much for cities. See that amount of cars into 3 buses or 1 light rail? You're creating space for economic opportunity, for active living, but you can't do it if you fill it with cars. So some cities are taking out freeways. There are 22 now have taken out freeways. This is the classic, the Chongqing in Seoul, which was over a river. They've recreated a 10-kilometre long river parkway, and it's brilliant. It's also become a symbol of what they want to do for the future of their city. So people around the world have taken up this placemaking thing. Jan Gale, you know well in Sydney, he's worked in 50 cities now, and we wrote this about